So we're starting to see in many of the areas within the country some of the pressures that come along with growing so fast. And so public opinion now says, what is immigration an answer to? And have we thought through, the infrastructure and all the other things that are needed to grow at the pace that we're growing?
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council. For a few more short episodes, I'm with the CABC, and I'm joined by my fabulous co-host, the Honorable Christopher Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much, Scotty. And I'm going nowhere. So I don't know whether it's good or bad.
Going nowhere fast, meaning you're not leaving Wilson and you're not leaving Canusa Street. As I am, but that's a story for another day. We have a great podcast today with a good friend, really smart guy who knows everything about statistics. And statistics, can tell you a lot of things about life and our society and everything else, truly. And Anil Arora is his name. You'll introduce him properly. But Anil and I have known each other. I was trying to think how many years, but it's been for sure more than 10, maybe not as many as you and I, Chris, but we go back. So I'm excited. I haven't seen him in ages. I read about him in the newspapers, of course. But why don't you introduce our guest properly, and then we'll get right into it.
Absolutely. Scotty, our guest today, Anil Arora, is the Chief Statistician of Statistics Canada. He was first appointed Chief Statistician in September 2016 and then reappointed in June of 2023. So obviously so good they renewed him, which hopefully Canusa Street will be renewed for another season too. As Chief Statistician, in case you don't know, Anil has led the agency through several high-profile initiatives, including updates to the Statistics Act, which oversaw some greater authority for statistical operations, the establishment of the Canadian Statistics Advisory Council, and the overall modernization of the agency. He oversaw the successful conduct of the 2016 and 2021 censuses of the population and agriculture in the introduction of numerous initiatives, including the Disaggregated Data Action Plan, the Quality of Life Framework, and the Census of the Environment. So over his 28 years at Statistics Canada, Mr. Arora has developed systems that will provide Canadians with online access to interactive data and publications and the current census methodology that allows Canadians to complete their questionnaires securely and online. And we're online today. Delighted to have Anil Arora as our guest. Welcome.
Thank you very much to both of you for that very warm welcome. For a while there, I was wondering who you were talking about, but seriously, it's a pleasure to be with both of you. And as you mentioned, our relationships run deep, and in some cases, even beyond this portfolio, as you know, Chris.
Yes. Well, I was fortunate to have Anil as the client for one of my classes at Hopkins, where he helped us to work through some Health Canada issues, which were tremendous. So I know you have many hats. Every one of them you look good in.
But some are probably more fun than others. So let's talk about some things that are right in your wheelhouse. And let me preface this question by saying, for years and years, I always said the U.S. population is 300 million, the Canadian population is 30 million. And then somehow, when I wasn't looking, you announced recently that the population of Canada is actually 40 million. So I've got to update my own thinking about it. And I would love to know, Anil, from your perspective, what kind of growth or what kind of factors led to that kind of demographic growth? And also, has the U.S. kept pace? Or is Canada growing faster or slower than the U.S.? So I don't know if you have at the ready. I know you know everything about Canadian numbers, but I'd be interested in comparison also with, is it still 300 million and now you're 40 million, or has the U.S. gone up too? So what is driving that kind of demographic growth, and what's the comparison?
Well, thank you. You're absolutely right. And, I would say, even in Canada, when in mid-June, we said, by the way, we just passed the 40 million population mark. A few Canadians took note and said, what? When did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah.
So it really did, sneak up on, I think, a narrative that was there before, which was, we're in the 30-something. Most people would have kind of, still said we're there. What's interesting is that, Canada, for the last 15 years and even going back a bit, like, has been growing at a tremendous pace. In the last two censuses, fastest rate of the G7, 5.4 in the previous 5 year, 5.2 in the last, and that is a significant pace at which this country has been growing. I mean, obviously there's a decision to grow, so it didn't just happen. There's some policy choices that the government's made to get us where we are, but it is absolutely growing, not just faster than the US, but really of any of the other G7, and frankly, even when you look expand that to the G20, Canada has been growing at a just a tremendous pace, and so it is in that relative sense growing at a faster pace than the US. What's interesting is that in Canada, we're not growing because we're having more babies. Our fertility rate keeps on going down. In fact, we're down to 1.4, and so the US, for example, is growing more organically, like more domestically. 2/3 of its growth comes from internal growth and 1/3 from immigration. Whereas in Canada, really, we're looking at almost all of our growth attributable to immigration. And as it pertains to the labor market growth, almost 100% of that is now because of immigration.
That's really interesting. And you're right, it's a choice. I feel like comparing Canada and the United States, immigration is relatively uncontroversial in Canada. It's like the whole country made a decision that we want to welcome people from around the world. Whereas in the United States, it's actually quite controversial, right? People want to pull up the drawbridge. And I'm oversimplifying it, Anil, but is there a political consensus in Canada even still that people coming from around the world is good for the country, good for the economy, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that is a fair statement. 70+% of Canadians, favor immigration. 80+% of Canadians, see it as vital to the labor market growth, making sure that we have the kind of people with the services that we need, the tax base and the dependency ratios, all those kinds of things. But more and more, though, we are starting to see, for example, 30+% of the population in Canada saying, well, yeah, we like it, but really we'd like immigrants to have, be more connected to Canadian values, whatever that means in a sense. And recently, you probably have been following the news, which says we've got a housing crisis in this country.
Right. I was going to ask you.
Right. And so I think, some people are starting to question whether we've got the right pace. Are we going at a pace that's faster than our ability to accommodate? I mean, in 2022, we welcomed just over 1 million people in this country. I mean, just think about it, right? A country
in 1 year?
In 1 year alone. Now, 600,000 of them were temporary and non-permanent residents, 400,000 immigrants. And of course, as so many other countries, we've taken asylum seekers, and of course the just unfortunate situation in Ukraine, et cetera. So there's a lot of factors, but in 10 years we've tripled the number of students in the country. So I think we're starting to see in many of the areas within the country some of the pressures that come along with growing so fast. And so public opinion now says, not that they're all of a sudden against immigration, but people question, in a sense, what is immigration an answer to, and have we thought through the infrastructure and all the other things that are needed to grow at the pace that we're growing at.
Let me follow up on that, just sort of about understanding that number in terms of where it is. Are you seeing what we've traditionally seen in the US and other places where immigrants are coming and moving to big metropolitan areas, or is there a distribution that's seeing some of them in rural areas? What's the geographic distribution of all your new Canadians?
Well, we used to say, most of it is an MTV phenomena. That's, by the way, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So most of the immigrants go to, one of those three centers. Now, in the last 20, 25 years, we've started to see a little bit more of a distribution towards, the second kind of tier of the CMA, the Census Metropolitan Areas in Canada. So we're starting to see more people going to Edmonton and Calgary. Obviously, the West with the oil and the attraction there. Starting to see more people in Ottawa and in Winnipeg and other areas within the Greater Toronto area. So we are starting to see a little bit more diffusion to other centers, but by and large, I mean, it's a cities phenomena. We did see in the last while a real resurgence in Atlantic Canada, which, as many people would have known for a while. They were thinking about, what do we do about all these towns, and what do we do? Like, are we going to pack up things and shut things down? Well, you saw immigration actually kind of change the landscape in many of the Atlantic Canadian cities as well. So it's not just a city story, but it's also a regional story, and it's an economic story as well, because obviously immigrants go to where those opportunities are. And so if you see the oil and gas sector doing well, you see a little bit more of a shift into Alberta and some of the Western provinces and to Newfoundland with the offshore. But we are, we still, I would say the majority of the people, the immigrants that come in, do go to Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and then, as I said, our second tier cities, which puts a lot more pressure, right, in areas that are already stressed when it comes to transit and housing and healthcare and all those other issues.
Absolutely. And I remember Scotty mentioned Canadians' positive attitudes about immigration, which are still holding. But part of that historically, if I'm remembering right, was that Canada was selecting immigrants who assimilated well because they had college degrees or skills that were needed in the economy. When you look at people coming in, you've got temporary foreign workers, maybe not permanent. Are the new Canadians coming in as assimilatable? Sounds like the wrong word, but are they as easy to integrate into society, or are you getting people with a variety of skills and maybe having a skills mismatch? So that's part of the economic grind, or anyway, tell us a little bit about what people are bringing to Canada when they come.
Well, first of all, let me just go back in history for a bit. So pre-1967, Canada had a kind of a real affinity to inviting people from Europe and the United States, and I would say more of a the white kind of population. And then in 1967, the country made a real conscious change to say, no, I think we're going to have to invite people in this country that have the kind of skill sets that we need. They know one of the two official languages, and so it's kind of like a point system that favored success, and that success, I guess, in terms, I guess relates to economic integration. And then, right, people go to, where their families might be or friends might be, and that, turns into social kind of, integration first within the communities of, where they come from, and then, broader into the kind of the Canadian society. So 1967 was a real turning point, and it changed the nature of the population in a very big way. So prior to that, so we've kind of had sort of three big waves of, immigration. One right after the First World War, second one after the Second World War, and then I would say we're seeing that third wave play out now. But the waves are very different. The first two waves was really European and American and so on. This wave, started back in the, after that 67 change, where now it's more Asian countries, it's African countries. And so that changed the whole nature of the racialized population in Canada. And so today we're talking about, a racialized, immigrants make up about 23% of the population in Canada, racialized population, around that same magnitude, a little bit more. So the nature of Canada has changed in a very significant way. In a sense, there's a critical mass now that, communities, can have the kind of support and the social networks. You're starting to see more representation in corporate Canada, in the political systems and so on. So I think there's a very different tolerance, or a very different acceptance, and a very different kind of view about the advantages of immigration. Now, having said all that, to your point, even though, so we're now selecting, right? We select what are the skill sets, what are the language, all those things, as you said, that, increase the probability of somebody succeeding And so the promise of Canada, in a sense, is plays itself out. You come, you work hard, you make good choices, you got a great shot at success. Well, I would say, there's some stresses right now. COVID obviously disrupted everything for everybody. For a couple of years, nobody came to the country, just like nobody went anywhere. Well, what happened at that point is the government made some real choices because businesses were screaming for people. Universities were worrying about, are they going to have the revenues, because there's a huge dependency on students and foreign students and so on. So the government relaxed a lot of those kind of policies where it said people who are already here, can stay in a sense, right? Or made it a lot easier for them to stay. And so some of that growth was that pent up demand and the fact that people who are here, basically went from being temporarily here to now being permanently here. So it's shifted in a big way. The numbers and those numbers, as I said, now are 2/3 of the immigrants that come to Canada come from Asia. They come from India, China, Indonesia, and then you see all the other countries and so what was predominantly white and Europeans now is the exact opposite. Now we're seeing less and less. So the country is more, I would say, heterogeneous. So in a sense, you're also reflecting the values of a much larger racialized population, when you talk about, acceptance of immigration. And in many cases, when you look at like in Toronto or, if you look at Brampton or you look at, parts of Vancouver, we're talking about in some of those neighborhoods, 70% or in excess of 70% are, people from India or people from China or, so we're talking about this kind of, pockets where you wonder who the old term of who's the visible minority now, right? So it's so assimilation or, integration or whatever is really different. Rural Canada is very different. About 5% of the population immigrant. That's kind of, expected to go to about 10%. But when we're talking about Toronto, in the next 20 years, not even 20 years, we're expecting the racialized population of Toronto to be in excess of 70%. When we're talking about Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, in excess of 50%. So who's integrating with whom? I guess you could ask that question as well. But this is fascinating demographic and fascinating Absolutely. Changes that are happening, and they're happening at a pace that is just truly incredible.
It is fascinating, and it's one of the maybe politically incorrect terms that people used to call it is majority minority. But you're right, like who is who is the majority? Anyway, and the political discussions and ramifications both sides of the border are interesting. Well, look, we're going to take a little break from this fascinating conversation with Canada's chief statistician. And when we come back, Anil, I want to ask you about what else do you keep statistics on besides population and demographics? Because I feel like your job might be measuring other things too. And I would love to just hear some fun facts, maybe things that Canusa Street listeners don't know about what you measure and why it's important in policymaking. So we'll be right back.
What did Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and President Woodrow Wilson have in common? Yes, they both led their countries during wartime, but they were also the only leaders of their countries to hold a PhD. At the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, we follow these academic civil servants to bring the public the best nonpartisan research and analysis. We're the only think tank in DC focused on this vital relationship. So in addition to the great repartee you get to hear on Canusa Street, head over to wilsoncenter.org to check out the Canada Institute's work and events.
Welcome back to Canusa Street. I'm Chris Sands, and I'm here with Scotty Greenwood, and our guest this week is Anil Arora, the Chief Statistician of Canada. Welcome back.
Well,
thank you very much.
And thanks, Chris. So we've been talking about population, and by the way, we can come back around to that because it's fascinating, so no problem. But let's take a little side street here, away from population statistics. What else do you measure, Anil, and why is it important?
Well, so, in the United States, there are sort of 13 major statistical organizations, right? From Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Census Bureau, and then you've got the variety of justice statistics or agricultural statistics or transportation statistics, which are decentralized. Of course, there is my colleague Karen Irvis, who is in the White House and under the Office of Management and Budget, who has his job of, herding the cats and making sure the system kind of works as a cohesive whole. Well, in Canada, for the most part, all of that is centralized under Statistics Canada. So when you say, what do you do, Anil, in your spare time? Well, we have 450 different programs that cover the whole span of social, economic, and more environmental statistics, and then the integration between all of those. So we do the census every 5 years, unlike in the States, where you do it every 10 years. You have, of course, the American Community Survey, which is a rolling kind of, the equivalent of our long-form census. But, you put out the inflation. Well, we put out the inflation. Any of the big socioeconomic indicators that you talk about, whether it's trade, whether it's retail, wholesale, what's going on the environmental side of things, or on the labor force or the employment rate, we do that here at Statistics Canada. So 450 different programs, the census on top of that, and then the integration of all that. So this is Canada's national statistical agency, and we actually not only feed the policy requirements of the federal government, but we're integral in actually meeting the needs of our provincial and our territorial needs, our municipal governments that need the data. And in fact, what we do isn't just a passive provider of data and feeding the policy landscape on all the areas that you can think of, but it's actually ingrained into the way that our democratic system and our governance systems work. So, we collect taxes for the most part, the federal level, and they get redistributed. Those taxes get redistributed. Right. Of course, it's one is on per capita, but even our harmonized sales tax, it gets collected in one spot and then gets redistributed based on Statistics Canada's work on, how those categories are being consumed out there and the proportion of taxes that go out there. So the redistricting in the House of Commons, so the whole democratic representation, which is similar to what the census does in the States. So Stats Canada is kind of it is the integrated system in Canada for all the official statistics.
Okay, that's interesting. But let me ask it a little bit differently. So I know that you count people in different ways. Would you count trees, like on timberland? Is that part of your remit, just as an example?
Interestingly enough, now we don't have people going, say, 1, 2, 3, but there are technologies now that allow us to be able to do that, using satellite imagery and so on. But
does that come under your remit or no?
Yes,
okay.
It does.
All right. So that tells us how broad it is. Okay, let me ask you this. You're a career public servant. You've had, as Chris described in the introduction, and as I've experienced, because I've known you, I think, in 3 different portfolios, a very distinguished career. So Health Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and this is just your career in government, not to mention the rest. And now Stats Can. What's your favorite portfolio? Or if you weren't at Stats Can, let's say you can't say I love my current job. What's, based on your experience, what's the most interesting?
I'll answer it in the following way. I think being in this agency gives me that bird's eye view of, what's going on in almost every portfolio out there. We just released, yesterday, the Health of Canadians report. We are, we're talking currently about, housing and, the affordability issues of this country. We're segmenting, what is the lived experience of our youth today, and what's going on, inflation and its impact on, as a deterrent to investments in housing, for example, or, the affordability question that I meant. So being at Stats Canada is unique and it's special because I get to work with almost every single colleague across the whole federal public service.
Sure.
And be able to, shed light on important policy issues or help them, frankly, decide whether, their strategies or policies or regulations are having the kind of impact that they want it to have. So I love where I am because it gives me that intellectual stimulation. It gives me that kind of, bird's eye view of not just what's happening in one sliver, but, how are the trees that we've got, actually impacting the environmental footprint, the carbon sink, for example, and what does the impact of the wildfires doing, on the environmental side, but also on the economic side, because clearly, those trees have a huge impact on, lumber and even, Canada-US trade when it comes to these commodities. So I love the fact that this gives me that view. I mean, really enjoyed Health Canada because, that responsibility of making sure that our food and drug supply is safe is in itself such an important role. And
But it was hard, man. That was a tough job.
All these jobs are, in the public service, let me just be really, and I'm not just saying that, but these are tough jobs because frankly, there's just sometimes just no right answer. And these, the kinds of issues are really the nasty issues, and they take a long, long time, to kind of get traction and moving forward. That's what's kept me in the public service, frankly, for 35 plus years now.
Wow. Let me ask you about something. I know a lot of statisticians, are confident with their data in describing what happened and how it evolved because they've got the numbers to show it. But I want to ask about forecasting. And forecasting is always really important because if you know there are going to be 10% more kids, you got to have more spots in schools. And there are all sorts of public policy consequences to forecasting. How do you feel the state of forecasting is, maybe state of the art globally, because there's certain limitations, but also how you feel StatsCan is doing in terms of telling us a little bit about what's coming over the horizon and among Canadians and what we should prepare for?
What a great question. So first of all, I would say national statistical organizations are quite careful when it comes to getting into the forecasting game because we have this reputation, a very strong reputation with the kind of methodologies and the processes in place and the transparency that's inherent to, as you said, when we put out a number, we stand behind it. And that's why, it kind of differentiates itself as official statistics, just because of the rigor that goes into it. Forecasts by their very nature kind of present two challenges. First is that they're based on a set of assumptions, right? And those assumptions can change very rapidly or, with the economic or social or other factors. And so when those assumptions change, well, then the forecast has to change. And so, all of a sudden people will go, well, but you said yesterday it was going to be this in year this, and today you're saying, it's this. And so, it kind of butts up against that credibility of, why are you saying one thing today and another thing tomorrow? And it's a little harder narrative to explain. Yeah, but the input changed or the assumption changed, And frankly, population estimate is a good example of that, right? I mean, so if you're following, so we have 8 different scenarios of population estimates that we put out into the future, based on high, medium, and low growth scenarios. Well, I just explained to you in 2022, we had an unprecedented million, people into Canada. Well, obviously, it's going to change the medium growth, scenario to a higher growth scenario. And so when people look at a moderate or a medium growth and they go, well, wait a second, that's what you said yesterday. How come it's so different? It does put statistical offices in a little bit of a, but you got to read the details and you got to work. So that's the first thing. The second challenge it puts for national statistical offices is that, well, people say, but, if you put out a forecast of something, aren't you likely to, fudge your numbers so they look like, the forecast, and clearly nothing can be further from the truth. So it does kind of, in a perceived way, put people in this or statistical offices in this kind of defensive mode. So all that to say is that's the reason why statistical offices shy away, from doing a lot of this economic and, other forecasting in a very big way. It's not to say that we're not there. We have social policy, simulation models. We have a demographic, model, and we're doing more and more modeling. I mean, during the COVID crisis, we were front and center when it talked about, the modeling and the, what kind of PPEs we needed, based on sort of the, scenarios of how COVID might kind of change itself. So we have the capacity, we have the knowledge, but we're cautious. We're cautious about going too far. However, we're not cautious in the sense of providing inputs to others who want to be able to build those models. And so a lot of the models, whether it's digital twins or, whether others are forecasting or, economists who are saying, okay, based on the trends now, you can see the next quarter's growth to be this or whatever it is, they use heavily our data to be able to do that. And that's, I think, a comfortable place for national statistical offices is to give people the robust input so that those models can be well defined, and they can then go ahead and say, here are the underlying assumptions, that fit into that model.
That leads me to ask a question. I don't want to be fuzzy about it, but there's a part of that that's political because policymakers want to have the stats show they're doing well, and you're going to get a little bit of political back and forth. But in our sort of Western societies, we deal with that uncertainty with a lot of transparency and trying to make access to information. So if you question what somebody says, go back and look at the numbers and see how it goes. And a while back, I remember just as a sort of academic, it used to be that StatsCan publications were in print form, and there were university libraries that just had drawers and drawers of them. And we've now gone to computers and so on, but we've also gone through CanSim to fee-for-service access and subscriptions and so on. How do you square, a government's desire for you guys to bring in some revenue to offset your expenditure and all that prudent fiscal stuff with the desire to be as open and transparent as possible with data so that people can play around, see for themselves what's going on, and try to really be transparent so that you got people looking over your shoulder doing that fact checking or maybe just crowdsourcing on some of the assumptions? How do you balance that?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me just make it really, really clear. We charge, externally. Okay, people who are coming to our website and will, access everything on our website is free, freely accessible, etc. Okay, so where we do have a cost recovery, okay, and that's really important to note, is where somebody says, that standard product that you put out, I'd really like it by this instead, or this geography or whatever, or I'd like you to help me, take this variable. And if I link it to this variable, at the aggregate level and help us with, the particular need that I have, we say, yeah, happy to do that. But we're going to recover the costs, okay? Because this is a unique proposition for you as a business or an entity or whatever. It's not generally applicable to all Canadians, so you should really pay. It shouldn't be the taxpayer that subsidizes. And frankly, it keeps demand and supply in check, okay? And those rates are regularly reviewed to make sure that we're neither profiting, or excessively charging people or subsidizing. So it's cost recovery when it comes to those kinds of things. Now, what happens that we routinely will view those needs and demands out there. And if those demands are growing and growing, we will try to see how we can make that as a part of our standard offering and then make it free. Okay. And that's why you see hubs and portals, and you see more, and, analytic reports and data, et cetera, because we're constantly serving that need out there, because that's why we exist. We're there to serve the public. Why would we put more impediments than, that prevent people from using it? So we want them to use the data, and we want it to be easy, and we want them to understand and use it. So there's a lot of proactive efforts that, and I brought in a little bit of that kind of thinking way back when we made a lot of those publications free and redesigned CanSim back in the 90s to today. It would be some of our outreach and some of our partnerships and so on. So in many cases, what we're also doing is enabling others, like chambers of commerce, like the Business Data Lab that you may have heard of, and so on. So we're enabling them to then serve a community. We're working with Indigenous populations to see how we can increase the competence and the capacity so they can do a better job of serving their respective population, and on and on and on, with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, et cetera. Now, having said that, there is, we're a big department, and in a given year, we will do about between 125 and 140 million dollars worth of cost recovery business with other federal government departments. So, Health Canada has a policy to do, oral health or whatever, and they'll say, can you, give us a view about what's going on? And so then we will do a cost recovery set of surveys or work
within the government.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, Anil. So I want to ask one last question of you as the chief statistician. So our audience is mostly Canada and the US, but we have people from around the world that wander over to Canusa Street. What's the most surprising statistic about Canada that you think people don't really appreciate, that you've learned over your years?
Yeah, look, I think there are so many. I think a lot of people are surprised to learn, the natural resource endowment that we have in Canada, compared to what's going on in other parts. Most people are surprised at how diverse we are as a country. and how respectful we are of the diversity that's in this country. Most people are surprised to learn, that, even though we make a 0.5% of the population of the world, that we're, when it comes to the size of our economy, ninth, in the world. Most people don't,
amazing. Yeah.
So, I think it speaks to the strength of this country, obviously the rich endowment that we have, the innovative nature of our people, the diversity of thought, the democratic kind of institutions and their strength, and what an amazing country it is. And so most people don't put it all together to see the richness that Canada is.
I love that answer, and Canada truly is a wonderful country. It's my second favorite, actually, country in the world, because I'm American, of course. Anyway, Anil Arora, Chief Statistician of Canada, thank you so much for spending time with us. It is always great to see you. I hope I see you in person one of these days, but thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much to both of you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
It was great to see you again on Canusa Street. And you know what? You're always welcome, because here you will always count.
There you go. But always count. Okay. Well, Chris, I always love our conversations, and we had a few softballs and a few hardballs. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that Anil didn't take the bait from me on which portfolio he likes the best or the least, being at Natural Resources, being at Health Canada, or being at Stats Canada. But, having measurements to inform policy decisions and just to inform, how you want to think about the world, it turns out that's really important. And his work is really important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's something to be said for the Canadian model of having a central statistical agency. It's hard. We all debate. They say, you can have any opinion you want, but you can't have your own facts. But even here in the States, we often disagree about which numbers to point to. And because we have so many different, I think he said 13 agencies on the US side gathering numbers, kind of getting at how am I comparing things that are truly comparable actually falls on you, the user, not on the agency. So the integrity that he's tried to keep for his system, even in very political ways, I think really shows and lets him provide data that people in Canada can debate about, and even Americans can see and understand what's driving Canada and what's driving change. I think that's a great achievement.
I think it is too. And Chris, maybe on a future podcast, we could get into how it is, and maybe we'll have some historians, or I don't know, you'll help figure this out. But how is it that Canada continues to be so welcoming to the world, to immigration, whereas the United States and other countries really don't want any more people, even if it's good economically? Just politically speaking, it's not super popular. So I'd love to dive into that at some point, why we think it is that Canada is so open and welcoming versus other countries that would rather not. So maybe that's a future topic for us.
A future topic and a future question we should ask, because I think the thing about global migration is that its composition is always changing. But it's clear, if you look at the latest UN High Commission on Refugee data, that there are more and more people who are displaced by war, by conflict, by climate change. And there are a lot of people who are just in that stateless zone. They were part of a country that isn't there anymore, or that isn't constituted in the same way. And so in that kind of world, we really do have to not only understand what makes the Canadian model work, but will it survive all the changes that are coming through global migration? And that's a question we have to ask ourselves on the American side of the street as well. People do matter, and all of these questions about how we grow as a society and have the economic benefit, but also how we get along and how we can find some common ground to have policy debates on, like statistics that are reliable. I think those are all very important topics, not just on Canusa Street, but in the larger metropolitan area of Canusa land.
That's right. Well, and you juxtapose that with nationalism and movements that are exclusionary and radical. It's quite interesting. Anyway, all that to say, fabulous episode as ever, Chris. Great to see you. And
great to see you. We'll see you next time. At least for now, you're still our see you next time. And so we're not going to talk about anything else.
We're not going to talk about me migrating away from Canusa Street.
Not yet.
Other street. That's a little tease for people who haven't been keeping up with LinkedIn or whatever. And,
Stay tuned.
There's some new talent coming to the street, and that's also very exciting. So anyway, see you later, my friend.
All right. Stay tuned, everybody. See you later, Scotty.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.